Introduction. Skepticism is a philosophical school of thought that has been around for centuries. The Pyrrhonian variety of skepticism, in particular, has been gaining traction in recent years, as more and more people are beginning to see its benefits. In this article, we'll take a look at some of the most common objections to Pyrrhonian skepticism. What is Pyrrhonian skepticism? So what is Pyrrhonian skepticism, exactly? In a nutshell, it's the view that we can't know anything for certain. And because of this, we should suspend judgment on all matters. Sounds pretty extreme, right? That's because it is. The thing about Pyrrhonian skepticism is that it's not a view that you adopt lightly. It's a heavy burden to bear. What are the objections to Pyrrhonian skepticism? There are a few common objections to Pyrrhonian skepticism. Let's take a look at each one. First, some people might say that the skeptic is living in a state of denial because she's refusing to make any judgments about the world. Second, skeptics might be accused of being lazy because they're not willing to take on the responsibility of making decisions. Third, skeptics are often said to be dogmatic in their beliefs because they're not open to new information. Fourth, skeptics are sometimes seen as hypocritical because they make judgments about the world even though they say they're not supposed to. Fifth, skeptics are often criticized for being nihilistic, since they believe that nothing in the world has any real meaning. Finally, some people argue that Pyrrhonian skepticism leads to a state of paralysis where the skeptic is unable to take any action in the world. How do Pyrrhonian skeptics respond to these objections? How do Pyrrhonian skeptics respond to these objections? They don't. The whole point of Pyrrhonian skepticism is to suspend judgment. When a skeptic encounters an objection, they don't try to answer it. They simply recognize that the objection has been raised and note that it's something to think about. And then they move on to the next thing. This can be frustrating for people who are looking for a definitive answer, but that's not what Pyrrhonian skepticism is about. It's about exploring different possibilities and keeping an open mind. Are there any other objections to Pyrrhonian skepticism? Let's move on to some other objections that people have raised about Pyrrhonian skepticism. For starters, some people argue that the skeptical approach is just a cop-out, that it's easier to say, "I don't know," than it is to find an answer. Others claim that skepticism leads to a life without meaning or purpose. And finally, some skeptics argue that Pyrrhonian skepticism undermines our ability to make decisions and live our lives effectively. They claim that if we're constantly questioning everything we do, we'll never be able to get anything done. What is the verdict on Pyrrhonian skepticism? Okay, so we've talked about what Pyrrhonian skepticism is and what it does. But what do you think? Is it a valid way of looking at the world, or are there objections that can be raised against it? Well, let's take a look at some of the most common objections. 1. It's impossible to live a life without beliefs. 2. It's impossible to make decisions without beliefs. 3. It's impossible to know anything without beliefs. 4. Skepticism leads to nihilism and an inability to make choices. 5. Pyrrhonian skepticism is self-defeating because it undermines its own premise. Conclusion. While Pyrrhonian skepticism may be the most straightforward and logical approach to skepticism, it's not without its critics. Here is a comprehensive list of the most common objections to Pyrrhonian skepticism. 1. It's not possible to live a fulfilling life without beliefs. 2. Pyrrhonian skepticism is a form of nihilism that leads to despair and hopelessness. 3. Pyrrhonian skepticism undermines the foundation of knowledge and scientific progress. 4. Pyrrhonian skepticism is nothing more than a clever way to avoid making decisions and taking stands. Gist of objection. Pyrrhonian skepticism is self-defeating because it undermines its own premise. Pyrrhonian skepticism self-destructs.